Blood is thicker than water. That's the lie they feed you to keep you sitting at a table where you're starving. I was 28 when my parents turned their 40th anniversary into my public execution. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood up and I erased them. The Oak Ridge Country Club always smelled like floor wax and old money, a clinical, chemical scent meant to mask the decay of the people who paid the membership dues. Tonight, however, it smelled like a funeral. My mother, Diane, had insisted on Casablanca lilies, hundreds of them. They were shoved into towering crystal vases on every table, their heavy, suffocating perfume clinging to the humid July air. Every time I inhaled, the sweet, rotting floral scent coated the back of my throat. I stood just inside the double doors of the banquet hall, tugging at the hem of my navy blue dress. It was a safe dress. High neckline, conservative cut, bought off the clearance rack at a mid-tier department store. I'd spent 40 minutes trying to steam the wrinkles out of it in my cramped, windowless bathroom, but the damp heat of the evening had already brought them back. "You wore that." I didn't need to turn around to know it was her. The voice was a perfectly calibrated instrument of casual destruction. "Hi, Mom," I said, turning to face the matriarch of the evening. Diane was 62, but fought the reality of time with an arsenal of dermatological weaponry. Her skin was tight, glowing with expensive serums, and she wore a beaded silver gown that looked like liquid armor. She didn't hug me. We weren't a hugging family. Instead, she reached out with a hand heavy with platinum and diamonds, her cold fingers pinching the fabric at my shoulder. She rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger, her lips pressing into a thin, pale line. "It's a bit somber, isn't it, Chloe? We're celebrating 40 years of marriage, not burying a pet." She let go of the fabric as if it had greased her fingers. "But I suppose it's practical, given your recent overhead issues." Overhead issues. That was her sterile country club translation for the fact that my fiancé had emptied our joint savings account 3 months ago and vanished to Florida, leaving me to face an eviction notice and a mountain of his hidden credit card debt. I had spent the last 90 days sleeping on a second-hand mattress in a studio apartment above a bowling alley, vibrating with anxiety, while my parents debated whether lending me first month's rent was enabling my poor choices. "It's nice to see you too, Mom. Congratulations on the anniversary." I kept my voice flat, level. If you showed emotion, it was blood in the water. Before she could dissect my appearance any further, the crowd parted. The air in the room shifted, the ambient chatter lifting in pitch and energy. Sawyer had arrived. My older sister didn't walk into rooms. She descended upon them. She was draped in champagne silk that clung effortlessly to her athletic frame, her hair a cascade of expensive blonde balayage. She smelled of vanilla, sandalwood, and unquestionable confidence. Trailing half a step behind her was Greg, her husband, a man whose jawline looked like it had been chiseled by a bored Greek god, and who made a living moving imaginary numbers around on Wall Street. "Diane!" Sawyer beamed, kissing the air next to our mother's cheek. "Oh, darling." "You look luminous," my mother breathed, her entire posture softening. The rigid, judgmental armor melted away, replaced by genuine, unfiltered adoration. It was a transformation I had watched 1,000 times, yet the whiplash still made my stomach turn over like a dying fish. Sawyer turned to me, her perfectly glossed lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Chloe, you made it. I wasn't sure if you'd have the gas money." It was said lightly, a joke meant for the laugh track playing in her own head. Greg let out a short, nasal snort. "I walked," I said. It was a lie, but I wanted to see if she'd believe it. She just patted my arm, her manicured nails tapping against the cheap navy polyester. "So brave. Go get a drink, Chloe. You look tense." I walked away from them, letting the crowd swallow me. The cocktail hour was a blur of familiar, indifferent faces. Business partners, golf buddies, relatives who only ever spoke to me to ask when I was going back to grad school. I ordered a gin and tonic from the open bar. The bartender handed it to me in a thick, heavy, lowball glass. The ice clinked sharply against the rim. Condensation began to bead on the glass, dripping down to soak into my cheap suede heels. I stood near a pillar, pressing my back against the cool plaster, and watched my family. My father, Richard, was holding court near the ice sculpture. He had a booming baritone voice, the kind of voice that had never been interrupted in his entire life. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound, and slapped a state senator on the back. I took a long swallow of my drink. It tasted like pine needles and battery acid. I closed my eyes, listening to the ambient noise, the clatter of cocktail plates, the rustle of expensive fabrics, the hollow, rehearsed laughter. I told myself what I always told myself. Just get through the dinner. 2 hours. Smile, eat the free food, and disappear. I didn't know yet that there would be no disappearing. Not quietly, anyway. The transition to dinner was signaled by the rhythmic, aggressive clinking of a spoon against crystal. The heavy oak doors to the dining annex were pulled open, and a fleet of waiters in starched white shirts began directing the herd. The scrape of heavy mahogany chairs against the parquet floor created a low, vibrating hum that set my teeth on edge. I found my place card at table 9. It was tucked in the back corner of the room, near the swinging doors of the kitchen. Every time the doors opened, a blast of hot, greasy air cut through the scent of the lilies. I looked at the names surrounding mine. Uncle Arthur, my father's brother, who smelled perpetually of mothballs, spearmint gum, and scotch. Aunt Brenda, who was already complaining about the draft from the air conditioning. And, in a masterstroke of seating chart sadism, Greg. Sawyer was seated at the head table with my parents, elevated on a small dais at the front of the room. Greg had been relegated to the civilian tables, as he jokingly called it, and he was clearly displeased to be slumming it near the kitchen. He slumped into the chair next to mine, aggressively adjusting his cuffs so the face of his Rolex caught the dim chandelier light. "Tough break on the seating arrangement, huh?" Greg muttered, not looking at me as he immediately flagged down a waiter to demand a double bourbon, though I guess you're used to the cheap seats by now. "Hello, Greg," I said, staring straight ahead at the 4 forks lined up aggressively to the left of my plate. The symmetry of the silver felt oppressive. "So," he said, turning in his chair to face me, an unearned intimacy in his posture. "How's the transition going? Sawyer said you're living in a pretty vibrant neighborhood now. Lots of character." "It has a roof," I said flatly. Right, character." He took a sip of his water, swirling it like wine. "You know, if you ever need financial advice, not a handout, obviously, Richard made his stance on that very clear. But advice? My door is open. You just lack a wealth mindset, Chloe. You let things happen to you." My jaw locked. I pressed my fingernails into my thighs under the heavy linen tablecloth. The texture of the fabric was rough, industrial. You let things happen to you. My ex-fiancé forging my signature on a loan document wasn't a lack of a wealth mindset. It was a felony. But in my family's ecosystem, victimhood was the only true sin. If you were scammed, you were stupid. If you were hurting, you were weak. The first course arrived. A bitter, endive salad that tasted like dirt and vinegar. I pushed it around with my salad fork, listening to Arthur loudly chew with his mouth open. Then came the main course. Slabs of prime rib, thick and heavily marbled. The meat was cooked aggressively rare. As I pressed my knife into it, a pool of thin red blood bled out onto the white porcelain, creeping slowly toward the scoop of pureed potatoes. The metallic smell of the iron hit my nose, mixing nauseatingly with the floral rot of the lilies. I dropped my knife. It landed with a sharp clack. My stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. I couldn't eat. I picked up my wineglass filled with a surprisingly cheap Merlot given the venue, and took a sip to wash the taste of grease and resentment out of my mouth. At the front of the room, the lights dimmed. A sudden, piercing squeal of microphone feedback ripped through the hall. It sounded like a dentist's drill against a raw nerve. People winced, raising hands to their ears. Testing. Is this thing on? My father stood at the podium on the dais. The spotlight hit him, turning his silver hair into a halo. Dust motes danced in the bright beam of light, separating him from the rest of us in the dark. He tapped the microphone twice, the heavy thump-thump echoing in my chest cavity. "Ladies and gentlemen, Richard bellowed, leaning casually against the wooden lectern. He owned the room. He always owned the room. Thank you all for being here tonight. 40 years. 4 decades with the only woman terrifying enough to keep me in line. Polite, adoring laughter rippled through the tables. Diane smiled, a practiced, camera-ready expression of modest devotion. You know, when Diane and I started out, we had nothing but a rusted Ford Pinto and a lot of nerve, he continued, launching into the origin story I knew by heart. The myth-making, the self-made man who conveniently glossed over the 6-figure loan from his own father. I zoned out, tracing the rim of my wine glass. The condensation made my fingertips squeak slightly against the crystal. I waited for the speech to end. I waited for the toast. I waited to go home to my tiny apartment where it smelled like stale cigarette smoke, but where I was entirely, mercifully alone. But the speech didn't end. We built a legacy, Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming serious, resonant. And a legacy is only as good as the hands you leave it in. Which brings me to my daughters. My heart did a strange, irregular stutter. He never talked about me in his speeches. Never. Sawyer, he said, gesturing broadly to the right. The spotlight widened to include my sister. She looked radiant, practically glowing. My pride, the heir apparent, a woman who understands what it takes to build an empire. Let's hear it for Sawyer and her brilliant husband, Greg. The room erupted into applause. Greg raised his glass, puffing out his chest. I clapped slowly, my palms feeling cold and sweaty. Then, the spotlight snapped back to my father. He let the silence stretch. It stretched just a beat too long. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The comfortable warmth of the anniversary toast dissolved, replaced by a strange, crackling tension. Richard leaned heavily on the podium. He looked down at his notes, then looked up, his eyes scanning the back of the room, finding table 9, finding me. A slow, predatory smirk crept across his face. And then, he said, his voice dripping with theatrical, faux pity, "There is Chloe." The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't the respectful quiet of an audience hanging on to every word. It was the suffocating, heavy stillness of a crowd watching a car crash unfold in slow motion. Behind my father, a massive projection screen began to quietly hum as it lowered from the ceiling. Now, raising children is an investment, Richard continued, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. With Sawyer, it was blue-chip stocks, steady returns, constant dividends. He chuckled. But Chloe? Chloe is our venture capital project. High risk, zero return, a constant, thrilling gamble of our assets. A few scattered, nervous laughs broke the silence. At the table next to me, I saw a woman I didn't recognize look down at her lap, her cheeks flushing. The projector clicked on. A blinding square of white light hit the screen, followed by an image. My breath caught in my throat like a shard of glass. It wasn't a baby photo. It wasn't an awkward teenage yearbook picture. It was a screenshot. A massive, blown-up image of a text message thread. The blue and gray bubbles were 10 feet tall, glowing ominously over the heads of my parents. I recognized the date at the top. 3 months ago, 3:14 a.m. Dad, please. I know we haven't talked in months, but I have nowhere else to go. Mark took everything. The bank froze my accounts. The landlord gave me 3 days. I am literally begging you. Just a loan. I am terrified. He had taken a screenshot of the most humiliating, desperate moment of my entire life. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room blurred, turning into a smeared painting of tuxedos and gowns. The blood roared in my ears, a high-pitched rushing sound that completely drowned out the ambient noise of the banquet hall. Now, Richard's voice cut through the static in my head. He was pacing now, a comedian working the stage. When a man receives a text like this from his nearly 30-year-old daughter, he has 2 choices. He can bail her out again. Or he can recognize a brilliant educational opportunity. The slide clicked. It changed to a cartoonish pie chart titled, "The Bank of Mom and Dad," Chloe's liquidation. We decided it was time to teach Chloe about market consequences. So, instead of a loan, Diane and I took the money she asked for and we put it into a very special fund. He pulled a small silver box from his jacket pocket. We call it the Reality Check Trust. She can access it when she proves she can hold down a lease for 12 consecutive months without a man ruining her credit score. The laughter wasn't scattered anymore. It was roaring. It was a tidal wave of booming, sycophantic laughter from people who relied on my father for contracts, for country club endorsements, for their own proximity to power. They laughed because he commanded them to. I looked at my mother. Diane was sipping her champagne, looking at the tablecloth, a tight, polite smile frozen on her face. She wasn't stopping it. She had planned this with him. I looked at Sawyer. She was actively giggling behind her hand, whispering something into Greg's ear. I sat completely still. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel the hot prickle of tears behind my eyes. I felt cold. An absolute glacial cold that started in the center of my chest and radiated outward, freezing my veins, freezing the panic, freezing the 28 years of desperate, pathetic yearning for these people to love me. The tether snapped. It was a physical sensation inside my mind. A thick, frayed rope that had kept me tied to their dock for my entire life just quietly gave way. So, Chloe, my father boomed over the microphone, shading his eyes against the spotlight to look out into the dark where I sat. Come on up here. Come get your first installment of financial literacy. He held up a single, crumpled $20 bill. More laughter. At my table, Greg nudged me hard in the ribs. Go on, kiddo. Take a joke. He's just busting your chops. I looked down at my plate. The blood from the prime rib had fully soaked into the potatoes, turning them a gruesome pink. The smell of the raw meat and the sickeningly sweet Casablanca lilies mixed in the air, but they didn't make me nauseous anymore. They just smelled like what they were. Dead things. I picked up my heavy linen napkin. I deliberately brought it to my mouth and pressed it hard against my lips, leaving a bright red smear of cheap drugstore lipstick on the pristine white fabric. I dropped the napkin over the bloody meat, covering it completely. Then I stood up. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor. It was a harsh, ugly sound that cut through the dying laughter in the room. I didn't storm off. I didn't throw my wine glass at the screen. I didn't scream a dramatic monologue. I just picked up my small, scuffed leather purse. I looked at my father. He was still holding the $20 bill, his smirk faltering just a fraction as he read my posture. He expected a tantrum. He expected tears. He expected me to run out in shame so he could shake his head and tell everyone how sensitive and unstable I was. I gave him nothing. My face was a stone. I stared at him for 3 long seconds, just long enough for the silence in the room to turn from entertained to intensely uncomfortable. I turned my back on him. I walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. I didn't rush. I took slow, deliberate steps, my heels clicking methodically on the parquet floor. Click, click, click. Every step was a sentence. Every step was a wall going up. "Chloe!" my father called out into the microphone. The joking tone was gone, replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. He hated being ignored. "Chloe, sit down. Don't be dramatic." I didn't pause. I reached the double doors and pushed my weight against the brass bar. The doors gave way, and the heavy, humid night air rushed in, smelling of hot asphalt and impending rain. It was the best thing I had ever smelled. I stepped out into the dark, the heavy doors swinging shut behind me, cutting off his voice mid-sentence. The gravel crunched under my feet as I walked away from the light, away from the country club, away from the only family I had ever known. And as I walked into the pitch-black night, with no money, no car, and no safety net, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was free. The humidity hit me like a wet towel the moment the heavy brass-handled doors of the country club clicked shut. It was a suffocating, thick July night, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer over the pavement and sticks your clothes to your spine. I started walking. I didn't have a destination. only a direction away. The private drive leading up to the Oak Ridge Country Club was a mile and a half of meticulously manicured weeping willows and smooth, unblemished blacktop. My cheap suede heels sank slightly into the warm asphalt with every step. My toes were immediately pinched, the rigid cardboard-like structure of the discount shoes biting into my heels, but I welcomed the sharp, localized pain. It was a grounding rod. It gave my brain something to process other than the glowing white square of that projection screen burning into the back of my retinas. About 20 minutes in, my purse started to vibrate. It was a violent, erratic buzzing against my hip, a spasm of electronics and trapped anger. I kept walking, matching my breathing to the rhythm of my steps. Inhale, gravel. Exhale, crickets. The buzzing stopped. 10 seconds later, it started again. And again. It felt like I was carrying an angry wasp in my bag. By the time I reached the main highway, the sky had ripped open. It wasn't a gentle summer shower. It was a torrential, angry downpour. The rain was lukewarm and tasted faintly of exhaust. In seconds, my navy blue polyester dress was plastered to my skin, heavy and dripping. My hair, which I had spent an hour trying to coax into loose waves, flattened into wet ropes against my face. A passing semi-truck roared by, spraying my legs with a tidal wave of grimy puddle water. I laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound. It was a harsh, scraping bark that tore out of my throat, raw and unhinged. I stood on the shoulder of a 4-lane highway in the pouring rain, completely soaked, smelling of wet dog and roadside mud, with $42 to my name and an eviction notice waiting on my kitchen counter. And I laughed until my ribs ached, until the rain washed the cheap drugstore foundation off my cheeks and into my collarbone. A mile down the road, the neon sign of a 24-hour diner bled red and blue into the foggy night. The Starlight. 2 letters were burnt out, so it read, the S. Arley H.T. I pushed through the glass door. The bell above it gave a pathetic, muted jingle. The sudden blast of the air conditioning made me shiver violently. The place smelled wonderfully, beautifully foul, a heavy mixture of burnt filter coffee, industrial bleach, and old frying oil. It was the absolute antithesis of Casablanca lilies. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Barb looked up from the counter. She took in my dripping dress, my ruined shoes, and the mascara smeared under my eyes. She didn't ask questions. She just grabbed a stack of paper napkins and pointed to a booth in the far back. I slid into the vinyl booth. The seat was patched with a square of duct tape that scratched the back of my thigh. I took the napkins and pressed them to my face, soaking up the rainwater. My purse vibrated again. I unclasped the brass latch and pulled the phone out. The screen was cracked in the top left corner, a casualty of Mark throwing my keys at me on his way out the door 3 months ago, but the notifications were clear. 17 missed calls, 42 text messages. I opened the thread. Dad, 8:14 p.m. Get back in here immediately. You are making a scene and embarrassing your mother. Dad, 8:19 p.m. If you walk out on this family, don't expect us to be here when you come crawling back. Grow up. Sawyer, 8:25 p.m. You are literally a psychopath. Dad was just making a point. Stop throwing a tantrum and come inside. Mom, 8:35 p.m. Chloe, please. People are asking questions. Richard is furious. Just come back and apologize. Dad, 8:45 p.m. I am cutting your phone plan tomorrow. See how far you get without my charity, you ungrateful little brat. I stared at the glowing pixels. Apologize. That was the operative word. That was the currency my family traded in. The utter degradation of self in exchange for proximity to their wealth. My mother wanted me to apologize to the man who had just stripped me bare in front of 200 people. My thumb hovered over the screen. My hands were shaking, not from the cold of the diner, but from the adrenaline crash. A heavy, nauseating wave of exhaustion washed over me. For a split second, the old conditioning kicked in. The terrified little girl inside me screamed to text back, "I'm sorry. I'm coming back. Please don't cut me off. Please don't hate me." Barb appeared at the table, slapping down a thick ceramic mug. She poured steaming black coffee into it. "You want sugar, hun?" she asked, her voice raspy from cigarettes. "No," I said, my voice cracking. "Black is fine. Thank you." She nodded and walked away, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the linoleum. I wrapped my freezing hands around the hot ceramic mug. The heat seeped into my palms, steadying the tremors. I looked back at the phone. I tapped the small I in the top right corner of my father's contact profile. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen. The letters were printed in stark, unforgiving red. "Block this caller." I tapped it. A confirmation bubble popped up. I tapped block contact. The knot in my chest loosened, just a fraction of an inch. I went to my mother's contact. "Block this caller." I went to Sawyer's contact. "Block this caller." I went to Greg's contact, just for good measure. "Block this caller." Then, I did something I should have done 3 months ago. I opened my banking app, looked at the tragic balance of $42.16, and drafted an email to the leasing office of my apartment building. "I will be vacating the unit by Sunday. Keep the deposit." I set the phone face down on the sticky Formica table. I picked up the coffee mug and took a long, slow sip. It was bitter, scalding hot, and tasted faintly like copper. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. 6 weeks later, I was living in a room that was exactly 9 feet by 11 feet. It sat directly above a 2-4-hour laundromat in a neighborhood Sawyer would have described as an emerging market, which was her sterile way of saying unsafe. The room smelled perpetually of bleach, hot dryer lint, and stale rain. The floorboards sloped violently to the left, and the single window looked out onto a brick wall covered in faded graffiti. I had secured the lease by pawning a white gold tennis bracelet my mother had given me for my college graduation, the only gift she had ever given me that hadn't been conditional. It netted me exactly $2,000, enough for first, last, and a rusted, oscillating fan from a thrift store. I got a job at a wholesale garden center on the edge of the city limits. It wasn't glamorous. I wore steel-toed boots, thick canvas pants, and a green polo shirt that trapped my sweat against my ribs. My days were spent hauling 50-pound bags of mulch, arranging pallets of ceramic pots, and sweeping up spilled fertilizer. My fingernails were permanently stained brown. My cuticles were cracked. My muscles ached with a dull, continuous throb that I had learned to welcome. The exhaustion was honest. It wasn't the psychic, draining fatigue of trying to anticipate my father's moods or navigate my mother's passive aggression. It was the clean, heavy tired of physical labor. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August. The air inside the greenhouse was thick and wet, smelling of damp earth, crushed tomato leaves, and nitrogen. I was kneeling on the concrete floor, organizing a row of root-bound hostas, when I heard the familiar, syncopated click of expensive heels. Click, pause, click, pause. It was the sound of someone trying to avoid stepping in mud. I didn't look up. I kept my gloved hands buried in the cool, dark soil, pulling a weed from the base of a plant. "Well, you really went off the deep end, didn't you?" The voice was pure, distilled Sawyer. I sat back on my heels, wiping my forehead with the back of my wrist, deliberately smearing a streak of dirt across my brow. I looked up. Sawyer stood in the aisle, looking like a misplaced magazine cutout. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse, tailored trousers, and pristine beige loafers. She was holding her designer handbag tight against her ribs, as if the surrounding ferns might try to pickpocket her. "Hello, Sawyer," I said. My voice was calm, unbothered. Her eyes darted around the greenhouse, taking in the rusted metal fans, the water-stained plastic roof, and finally, me. Her gaze snagged on the dirt under my fingernails, on the sweat patches staining my cheap uniform. A flicker of something crossed her face, disgust, certainly, but also a strange, sharp confusion. "Dad, cut your phone off," she said, crossing her arms. "I noticed," I replied. "I got a prepaid one at the gas station. It works fine." She sighed, a heavy, dramatic sound, and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Chloe, this is ridiculous. You've made your point. You played the martyr. Dad is. Well, he's not apologizing, obviously, but Mom has been crying for weeks. It's exhausting for all of us. I'm sorry Mom's crying, I said, stripping off my heavy canvas work gloves. I tossed them onto a pallet of soil. But I haven't made a point, Sawyer. I just left. You're living above a laundromat, she snapped, her voice rising, echoing slightly in the humid air of the greenhouse. Greg had his private investigator pull your lease. You're working in a dirt factory. You're humiliating yourself. I'm actually quite happy, I said, and to my profound shock, as the words left my mouth, I realized they were true. The knot in my chest that had been tight for 28 years was gone. The constant, vibrating anxiety was gone. Sawyer stared at me. She uncrossed her arms and reached into her expensive bag. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The heavy cardstock felt familiar. It was the stationery from my father's home office. Dad wants to buy a condo, she said, her tone suddenly shifting to something resembling a business negotiation. In your name. Something in the West End. A nice area. He'll cover the down payment and the first year of HOA fees. You just have to agree to come to Sunday dinners again. And, act normal. She held the envelope out toward me. The edge of the paper trembled slightly in the humid air. I looked at the envelope. I knew exactly what it represented. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a leash. A beautifully gilded, expensive leash. If I took it, I would be right back in the dining room. I would be the punchline again. I would be the venture capital project that failed. I looked from the envelope to my sister's face. For the first time in my life, I really looked at Sawyer. I looked past the balayage and the silk and the arrogant smirk. I saw the tight, panicked pinch at the corners of her eyes. I saw the way her jaw clenched. I saw a woman who was terrified of losing her position at the right hand of the king. She wasn't here because she missed me. She was here because my absence had disrupted the ecosystem. Without me there to be the failure, the spotlight of my father's crushing expectations was solely on her. Keep it, I said quietly. Sawyer's arm remained suspended in the air. Chloe, don't be an idiot. It's a $500,000 property. I don't want it, Sawyer. I stood up. My knees popped loudly in the quiet greenhouse. I brushed the loose soil off my canvas pants. I don't want his money. I don't want his condos. And I don't want to eat dinner with you people ever again. You're going to stay here? She demanded, her voice shrill now, the mask slipping completely. Scraping mud off the floor for minimum wage? You're a loser, Chloe. You've always been a loser. Her words hit the air, harsh and venomous. But they didn't land on me. They bounced off. The armor I was wearing wasn't made of silver beads or expensive silk. It was made of silence. It was made of the absolute, unshakable knowledge that I survived them. Maybe, I said softly, but I'm my own loser now. I turned my back on her. I walked toward the pallets of terracotta pots, my heavy boots scuffing against the concrete. Chloe, she yelled. The sound was frantic. Chloe, you can't just walk away from us. We're your family. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop walking. Watch me, I whispered to the empty air. I heard her stand there for a long time. I heard the erratic, angry breathing. And then, finally, I heard the click of her heels. Fast, uneven, retreating. The heavy plastic flaps of the greenhouse entrance whipped shut, and she was gone. I stood alone in the damp, quiet aisle. The scent of wet soil and growing things filled my lungs. I reached out and touched the rough, porous surface of a terracotta pot. It was sturdy. It was grounded. It was real. I had no savings. I had a ruined credit score. I lived in a room that smelled like bleach, and my dinner that night was going to be canned soup, heated on a hot plate. But as I stood there, in the grit and the dirt, the only sound, the low hum of the exhaust fans, I took a deep breath. The air belonged to me. The silence belonged to me. The blood had washed away, and all that was left was the bone. And the bone was unbreakable. Have you ever realized that The people who are supposed to love you sometimes only love the power they hold over you. If you've ever had to walk away from your own blood just to survive, hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs the courage to finally leave a toxic table. And subscribe to the channel for more stories about starting over. Because the truth is, the best revenge isn't success. It's forgetting they ever existed.